Thanks, Jamie. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thanks for coming back. I know it's nicer outside than it is in here, so thanks for coming in. So I'd briefly like to cover 3 topics today. The first is really to just define climate change for you, as well as food security, which has already been done, thanks. And then I'm just going to ask a couple questions. First, how will climate change affect crop production? And then what are the best targets to improve food security in the future? So what is climate change? We'll start there. And so climate change is defined as a significant and lasting change in the statistical distribution of weather patterns. And this usually ranges over from decades to millions of years. And in this graph, what you're looking at is both the CO2 concentration, that's basically the yellow here, and also the temperature of the globe over the last 650,000 years. And so what you can see is that climate has changed. It's changed pretty dramatically. There have been periods of quite warm temperatures and then ice ages as well. And so climate change is a natural part of the Earth's system. And past variation in climate change can be explained by a number of different things. Milankovitch proposed first that ice ages peak every 100,000 years, and that's based both on the eccentricity of the Earth's axis as well as the angle of the Earth, or the obliquity, as well as kind of the wobble of the Earth on its axis. And you certainly can see that 100,000-year pattern of ice ages in the geological record. The solar intensity also changes, and so this causes some variation in climate. And things like volcanoes also can affect climate as well. They can cause aerosols to be in the atmosphere, and that can scatter light and cause cooling periods. But what I'm talking about, and what you read in the newspaper when you hear about climate change, is really anthropogenic climate change. And this refers to human-induced global warming and the associated changes in the atmosphere and climate that are from this. And so in particular, human activities are altering the composition of the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increasing. So is surface ozone concentration, and ozone is an allotrope of oxygen, so it has 3 molecules of oxygen rather than 2. And carbon dioxide and ozone are good examples of asymmetric molecules, and so that means that they absorb infrared radiation. And by doing that, they cause an increase in temperature, and so the surface temperature is also increasing. These changes in temperature, in turn, cause changes in evaporation, which lead to changes in precipitation patterns. So both droughts are increasing in some areas as well as flooding in other areas. And so to put today's climate change in context with the geological past, we can look at the concentration of different greenhouse gases over time. And so this is just thousands of years before present, so this is 650,000 years ago, and this is today. And we're looking at different constituents of the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is in red here. Nitrous oxide is in green, and then methane is in blue. And so these are the concentrations of these gases. Methane ranged from about 300 to 700 parts per billion over the past 650,000 years. Today we're at about 1750 parts per billion. CO2 is in red here, and this graph was actually produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it was produced for the year 2008. And so in 2008, the atmospheric CO2 concentration, here's the scale of the last 650,000 years that goes to 300. We were at 370. Today we're at 396. And in the South Pole, they measured concentrations over 400 parts per million for the first time in history. And similarly, nitrous oxide concentrations today, the green star, are outside of the range of the last 650,000 years. And so this table just provides a little bit more information about what the atmospheric concentration of different greenhouse gases, or gases that absorb infrared radiation, were before the Industrial Revolution versus what they are today. And so this is in 1998. This is today's concentration. And so these are, I just looked those up a few days ago. And so what you can see is that we're exceeding what we've seen in the last 650,000 years. And of course, what's important about all of these molecules is that they absorb infrared radiation, meaning they trap heat. Scientists ascribe a number to how much heat these gases these gases absorb, and that's called the global warming potential. And this is basically a relative scale. If you have 1 molecule of CO2, it's given a global warming potential of 1. And then all other greenhouse gases are ranked according to CO2. And so CO2 concentrations have risen from a pre-industrial concentration of 280 to a current concentration pretty close to 400. And this is in parts per million. So if you have 1 million molecules of gas in the atmosphere, 396 of those million are CO2. Okay, and this is, it's about 60 or 70% more than it was before the Industrial Revolution. Others like methane have increased even more. And methane is a molecule that has 21 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. Methane is present in the atmosphere in parts per billion, though, rather than parts per million. So now you need 1 billion molecules of air, and 1,700 of those are methane. And so all of these gases are contributing then to warming today. And you can think about this in terms of watts per meter squared, or warming per unit area. And this is a chart that shows the radiative forcing of climate between 1750 and today. This is another IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change chart. And so you can see that the increase in CO2 concentration has caused a warming of about 1.5 watts per meter squared. Okay, and so other greenhouse gases, here's methane, there's the nitrous oxides and the halocarbons, also cause warming, as does surface ozone, which is a pollutant. Some human effects have had a cooling effect on the atmosphere, so the fact that there are aerosols in the atmosphere that scatter light and cause a cooling effect have dampened some of the human-induced warming. And so basically, on average, human activities have warmed the Earth by about 1.5 watts per meter squared on average. And of course, this is measurable. It's measurable just with thermometer readings. And so what this graph now shows you is the temperature anomaly, or the difference in temperature. If you take the average temperature from 1900 to 2000 and look at how any given year's temperature ranks according to that average, this is what's projected here. And so you can see North America has increased in temperature by about 1 degree. Europe is similar, as is Asia. And if you look globally over the land, we've warmed by about 1 degree over 1900 to 2000, and it's a little less over the oceans. What the black line shows you are thermometer readings, and so these are the actual measured temperatures. What the blue and the pink represent is when we couple models of atmospheric models, and we just include the natural forcing, so the changes in the Milankovitch cycles and the solar intensity, etc., you get the blue pattern. When you include the change in greenhouse gases into the atmospheric models, you get the red pattern. And so this is just further evidence that, in fact, the warming is anthropogenic. And so worldwide, again, this just again shows you the temperature anomaly, this time from 1901 to 2000. And so what you can see is that the increase in the last 20 years has been notable. Okay, so what's projected for the future? What's projected for the future is certainly that there's going to be a continued increase in atmospheric CO2 concentration. And so these are different scenarios that are put forth by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they represent different investments in either fossil fuel intensity or alternative intensities and more regional distribution of energies. And so a heavily fossil fuel-based world would be one that follows this A1F1 scenario, where we're looking at concentrations of 550 to 600 parts per million by the middle of this century, to about 1,000 at the end of this century. And then these are some other scenarios that represent a bigger investment in alternative energies and less of a globalized marketplace. Where we actually are today is shown in this graph, and this is the observed emissions. And so what we're emitting in terms of CO2 into the atmosphere has risen from about 6 gigatons or petagrams of carbon per year in 1990 to nearly 9 and we're very close to 9 today in 2011. This downward turn that you see right there is the 2008 global recession that was measurable in terms of carbon output into the atmosphere. We have caught back up, and in this graph, the red line is the A1F1 model. You can see that during most of the 2000s, we were pretty squarely on that, and we are back on that line now. And so that represents really this upper limit here. And of course, if we continue to emit CO2 into the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases, then there will be warming. According to kind of the A1 or A2 scenario, we're looking at about 4 degrees of warming by the end of this century. Okay. And so this just shows you the projected warming from 2020 to 2029 and then 2090 to 2099. And so what this illustrates is the warming is expected to be greater over land than over the water and greater in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere. And that's just a matter of where the land mass is. And the land mass also includes most of the emissions, but we do have greater warming intensity over the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere, and certainly you can see the trend of greater warming over water, or over land compared to water. Another critical aspect of climate change that gets ignored when you just look at global trends is how the extremes will be impacted. And so this is a recent science article that estimated the likelihood that future summer temperatures will be outside of the realm of what's been experienced to date so far in the temperature record. And so what you can see if we look at Chicago, Illinois here, we're looking at a 70 to 90% probability that the average summer temperature will be warmer than anything we've experienced to date. And so we're moving into a realm of where we don't even have analogs today of what the conditions will be like in the future. If we think about how rainfall is changing or is projected to change in the future, I think it's quite useful to look at the distribution of rainfall today. And so this is going from the far northern hemisphere, here's the equator, to the southern hemisphere. And so you can see sort of the temperate regions, like where we live here today in Illinois, we get a moderate amount of rain. Then you get a dip here and more precipitation at the equator with a similar pattern in the southern hemisphere. And so what's basically projected to happen is that the wetter regions will get a little wetter and the drier regions will get a little bit drier. Okay? And on top of this, also the extremes are expected to continue. So some place like Chicago, Illinois may receive the same amount of precipitation, but what will happen is that precipitation events will come in larger amounts, but with more space between them. So longer, drier periods with heavier rainfall patterns is also projected for the future. Okay, so I'm going to move in quickly now to what is food security, and you're going to spend 3 days talking about food security, so I'll just kind of remind you of some of the basics here now. And so food security was defined at the World Food Summit in 1996 as when all people at all times have access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active life. And there were basically 3 pillars that this was built upon. One is the availability, the second is access, and third is food use. And so availability is just quantities of food available on a consistent basis. Access is having the resources to obtain food for a nutritious diet. And then use is basically knowledge, whether a population can use that food. And I think you'll spend most of the next 3 days talking about these issues. And so I won't go into that in too much more detail. But of course, when you're talking about food security, it's also important to think about food insecurity and where food insecurity is. And you'll probably see this map more than just today. This is the hunger map of 2011. And so the warmer the colors, the more hunger. And so the dark maroon color here represents places where greater than 35% of the population is undernourished. And so these are the areas of greatest food insecurity. and the red color is between 20 and 34%. So of course, the regions of greatest food insecurity are Africa and also Asia and South America to some extent. So how can we understand the impacts of a changing climate on something like food security? And the way that scientists get at this for the most part is to use statistical models and mathematical models to link the changes in climate to potential changes in food security. And so you can start with atmospheric models that project climate or predict climate. You can link those to agricultural system models that can tell you how much crop can be produced for a given climate in a given area. And then you can link that to a trade model, because obviously production is very tied into how much countries are willing to trade and what the value of that will be. And then link that to a hunger impact model. And so you'll probably talk about each of these steps at some stage during the next 3 days, but I'm a plant physiologist in training, and so I'm going to start with this first step here, which is really how does climate impact crop production? And so what direct effects does climate have on a plant's ability to grow and produce grain for consumption? So that's the second question, and that's how will climate change affect crop production? And so climate change has many aspects to it. As I mentioned before, some of the ones that directly impact plant performance are the rise in CO2, the rise in temperature, the rise in atmospheric pollutants like ozone, and also water availability has a direct effect on plant performance. And so I'm going to start with CO2 because it's the most important greenhouse gas that humans are emitting into the atmosphere, and it's also the basis, it's the molecule that plants use to make carbohydrates and to grow. And so for many plants, those with so-called C3 photosynthesis, the rise in CO2 actually stimulates photosynthesis and causes them to grow more and grow bigger. And that's just because CO2 is taken up through the small pores in leaves called stomata, and it's fixed in the process of photosynthesis into sugars. And then those sugars are exported out to roots and growing leaves and also to sink tissues like flowers so that plants can produce more. So how do we know that rising CO2 has a beneficial effect on plants? And so what I'd like to just show you right now is a little bit about one of the experiments where I work, and this is a free air concentration enrichment, or a FACE facility. This one that I'm showing in the picture here is in Urbana, Illinois. And so what you're looking at here is kind of a farmstead here. This big tank is a huge liquid CO2 tank, and it's got small gasifiers next to it. And then these plots each show rings where we're manipulating the concentration of CO2 around a canopy, in this case a soybean. So if we zoom into one of these squares here, what you'll see is a ring that's about 65 feet in diameter, and these pipes all have small pores in them that were drilled in with a laser. This is a manifold here that has tubes connecting out to outlets and inlets in each of these pipes. And then in the center of this ring, there's a weather station. So we're sensing wind direction and wind speed, and we're also measuring the concentration of CO2. And this is measured in real time and then radio transmitted to a control computer, which then controls this manifold. And so if the wind is blowing from this direction, it's sensed in the center of the ring, and then these sides of the ring are open. The eddies of wind basically carry the gas over the ring so that we're enriching the air around these soybean plots. Every 4 seconds this is sensed. If the wind direction changes or the wind speed changes, then the amount of CO2 that we emit also changes. And so in this way we can simulate future CO2 concentrations in a farm setting. And so we set up all of this experimental facility after we plant with a regular planter. We take it all down right before the combine comes through. And so we can manipulate CO2. We can also manipulate ozone concentration using basically the same sort of system. We can also manipulate temperature, and we do this with infrared heaters, which are shown here. And we can manipulate soil moisture availability with awnings. And so this is an awning that basically retracts during the night to catch nighttime rainfall and then goes back up during the day so that it doesn't interfere with solar radiation. So we can do CO2 or ozone drought and temperature, and we can measure directly how these changes in the atmosphere impact crop production. The FACE site that I work at in Urbana is not the only one in the world. There's kind of a global distribution of them. So there's been a number in North America and also a number in Europe. There's an active one in China now, as well as one in Australia working on wheat that's active. And so what you'll notice on this map, if you look carefully, is that there's a big gap in knowledge for all of the tropics, and certainly all of Africa. And so I think this is quite important because what we know about how plants respond, and crops in particular, respond to changes in climate, what we know from large-scale field experiments, we know in the temperate system. And those results aren't always directly applicable in tropical systems. But what we do know is that stimulation of photosynthesis leads to a stimulation in biomass or plant mass production, and that leads to a stimulation in absolute yield. And so if we look at our major food crops, this is maize, which basically shows no response, and that's because it has a different physiology. It has C4 photosynthesis, so essentially photosynthesis is supercharged. It's already saturated at today's CO2 concentrations. And this isn't a biology talk, so I don't want to go into that, but CO2 has no direct effect on corn yields. It does stimulate rice and wheat and soybean and barley yields in the future. And so this is quite a good thing. And you'll see why in a minute. One of the negative impacts of CO2, though, is that because the plants have a higher carbon concentration, there's a dilution effect in the grains. And so what you're looking at here is the change in nutrient concentration in grains of major crops. And so you can see the nitrogen content goes way down, as do many other elements. And so while CO2 will increase the amount of grain, it will decrease the quality of that grain in the future. But I think the real question is, will these future increases in atmospheric CO2 counteract the negative impacts of rising temperatures, more drought stress, and more air pollution? And so what we know, and this is just one example from the literature, is that high CO2 concentrations, in this diagram shown in the white circles, causes a stimulation in photosynthesis. And so this is just showing you how much more carbon dioxide the plants are taking up. This doesn't always lead to an increase in yield or edible product, and that's because it's not just about photosynthesis. In this case, pollen viability is very negatively affected by temperature. And so seed set is also negatively affected by temperature. So in this example, it doesn't matter that photosynthesis is stimulated because the reproductive processes are quite sensitive. The same is true, that was an example from peanut. Here's an example, just a meta-analysis from wheat. And so this is just showing you the relative change in wheat yield in about 200 studies of wheat that have been done. And in high CO2, there's almost a 20% change in yield. When you increase the temperatures by about 4 degrees Celsius, you get about a 20% decrease in yield. When you put them together, you still get about a 5% decrease, a 5 to 10% decrease in yield. And so CO2 can't always mitigate the negative effects of temperature. And so if we just review this, the sensitivity of reproductive processes to high temperatures may negate much of the benefit of elevated CO2. And current trends indicate that even in temperate climates, warming trends are associated with decreases in crop yields and not increases. And so we'll talk about water next, because obviously water is also critical to crop production. And when plants are grown in high CO2, what they do is slightly close the pores on their leaf, and this is just an image of one of those pores. And so there are thousands of pores on the leaves of plants that allow gases to come in and also water to come out. And this is really driving transpiration into the atmosphere, as well as driving CO2 into the plant for fixation. And so if a stomatal pore is like this in ambient CO2, it closes like this in elevated CO2. And it closes by about 20%, and this is pretty common across all plants. And what's interesting is you can pick this up in thermal images. And so this is just an image of one of the face rings that I showed you before. This is a thermal image. And what you can see is that the temperature inside the plot is higher than the temperature outside the plot. And that's because you can imagine going outside and exercising right now, and if you have all of your, if I don't put any Vaseline on you, you sweat, you cool off from evaporative cooling. If I slather Vaseline over your pores and you can't sweat, you're going to heat up, right? And this is essentially what happens to the crop canopy in elevated CO2. The pores are closed a little more, there's less evaporative cooling, and so the canopy heats up. For plants, this can be quite a good thing if the temperature isn't too high, because it means that more moisture can be conserved in the soil. And in fact, that's what we see. Despite higher temperatures, the evapotranspiration of the canopy, so the amount of water leaving the canopy, is reduced, and more moisture is stored in the soil. And so what that means is that in places where there's moderate amounts of drought, high CO2 can stimulate production. And it can stimulate production quite dramatically because going into a drying period, plants grown in high CO2 have more moisture available to grow. But if we think about some of the changes in climate that have happened recently, high CO2 probably won't make any difference. And so this is just showing you the this is a satellite image of Western Australia. And what you can see here is the wheat belt of Western Australia in July of 2005. And it's quite green there. In 2006, there was no water at all. And so there was essentially crop failure in that region. And because of the scarcity of water in Australia in that region, then it wouldn't have mattered what other changes there were in the atmosphere. These plants wouldn't have survived. And of course, this is true for much of Africa as well. And so, to summarize, what we know is that the decrease in the amount of water leaving crop canopies at high CO2 improves soil moisture, and this has been observed for a range of crops. And this improvement means that crops will perform better during times of moderate drought, and this is particularly true in the temperate regions. But even in severely water-limited areas, elevated CO2 is very unlikely to benefit crop production. And so I guess part of the motivation for all of this work is that when you put all of this together and you run the statistical models and the mathematical models and ask the question, what will future yields look like? And so this is just a map from a group in the UK looking at a world in the future. This is the 2020s, the 2050s, and the 2080s. And what's shown in different colors is the percent changes in crop yield that are projected. The greens are an increase in crop yields, with the darkest color being a 20% increase, and the browns are decreases in crop yields. Yellows are kind of no change to a moderate change. Without CO2 in the atmosphere, it's quite a grim picture for the future. With CO2 in the atmosphere, it's not quite so grim. Regions that obviously are hurt the worst now will continue to be hurt the worst in the future. And that's true in terms of climate change as well. Okay, so just to summarize this section, rising atmospheric CO2 increases the yields of many crops, in particular those with C3 photosynthesis. But as temperatures and drought stress worsen, the benefits of high CO2 may be diminished. And of course, all of the large-scale manipulative experiments that have been done to date have been done in temperate regions. And so there certainly is a knowledge gap of how tropical systems will respond to climate change. So I'm going to move on to talk now about what are the best targets to improve food security. And I'd like to do this by talking about one of the papers that I suggested for reading before coming up here. And this one is led by a group at Stanford, and it's asking the question, what should be our targets and our priorities for the future? And so they asked this question basically by considering three things. First, what's the hunger importance of the crop? Or how important is that crop to food insecure people in a place? And second, they asked, what's the median projected impact of climate change on a crop's production? And third, kind of what's the impact of a worst case climate scenario on production of that crop? And so these questions really are about how do you assess risk and what kind of risk is the most important to you. And so they looked at, I think there's 17 or 13 regions here across the world. And in total, these regions account for about 95% of the malnourished people across the world. And so in South Asia, 30.1% of the world's malnourished people live in South Asia, 18% in China, and then in Africa is another about 15% all told. And so they did look at the most food insecure regions of the world, and then they modeled how crops that are grown in those regions will be affected by climate change. And so the climate change that they considered was basically the average change that's expected for the year 2030. And so it's the averages from 2020 to 2039. And so that's about a 1 degree warming for all of those areas. And in most places, there's no real change in total precipitation. So the total amount of precipitation, in some cases, it's a little lower. In other cases, it's a little higher. But in all cases, it spans 0. So it's close to average in this study. And so then they asked, well, how will those changes, that warming and that potential change in precipitation affect yields? And so I'm just showing you 2 of the case studies here. This is South Africa, and then this is Brazil over here. And so the colors that you see represent the hunger importance ranking. And so how important that crop is to food insecure people in that region. And so maize is red here because it has the highest hunger important ranking. Here, ground pea is yellow because it has a lower hunger importance ranking. In Brazil, all of the crops have a relatively low hunger importance ranking, and part of this just has to do with the proportion of hungry people. And then the production impact, so this is how much climate change is expected to alter these crops' production. And so the changes in temperature, largely in temperature for 2030 for South Africa, are expected to reduce maize yields by almost 30%. And wheat yields by about 15%. And in Brazil, wheat, rice, maize, and cassava are all expected to go down by about 5% due to climate change. And so they took all of these studies for all of the food insecure regions, and then they made this table here, asking the question of, okay, what should be the focus? What should be the priorities for the future? And they have different criteria. The hunger importance ranking is here from 1 to 30 or 31 to 60. The lower the number, the more important it is to food insecure people. The higher the number, the less important it is. And then they have 3 criteria. This first one, the one that's minus 10% here, means that at least 5% of the models predict greater than 10% yield loss for the future. And they list the areas and the crops there. And so that's quite important because that means it may not be very many of the models, and they tested about 100 models. And so at least 5 of them show a greater than 10% yield loss for this criteria. A second criteria is that half the models predict greater than 5% yield loss. So this is a different risk. Okay, so it may be higher probability that there will be some yield loss, but the yield loss may not be as great. And so these are the crops there were rapeseed in South Asia and maize in South Africa. And then the third criteria, where basically you have total agreement in the model runs that crop yields will be diminished in the future with the changes in climate, but the amount of that loss isn't specified. So it may only be 2%, it may be 5%, it may be 25%, but most of the models agree that there's going to be a detrimental effect on crop production. And so in different areas, obviously, there are going to be different targets, and people are going to have different assessments of risk in different places. But there are some crops, like maize in South Africa, that always come up. Whatever your criteria are, they always come up. And so perhaps these are the most likely targets for improving food security in food insecure regions. But arguably, as the population increases, and this is just just one projection of world population increases. It's important to maximize production everywhere. And that's also because the amount of land per capita is going down. And this probably will continue to trend down as the population increases, but also as things like sustainability enter into the conversation. And so arguably then it's important to increase crop yields everywhere, not just in the most food insecure regions. And so what are the considerations then for breeding for a future world? And I think one of the most important ones is that the increase in CO2 is uniform and it's global, and unfortunately it's committed. And so even if we stop emissions today or go back to 1980 levels today, because the Earth system is dynamic, it's going to take 20 years for that concentration to stabilize. And so this is a committed change in our future environment. And so any attempts to engineer crops to perform better in the future should be thought of with this uniform concentration or this uniform increase in atmospheric CO2 concentration. And certainly in parts of the world where high temperatures and drought stress already limit crop production, there's very little or no experimental evidence to base projections for future crop performance. And so that's quite a dreary picture that I've painted. And so I'd like to now talk about some things that maybe counteract that a bit. And the first is just some data from our own work, and this is that genetic variation in response to many climate change factors exists in crop species. And so this is good news. So this is just a look at a number of different soybean varieties, and this is their percent yield loss due to double the ozone exposure that we have today. And so Dwight is quite sensitive. It loses about 14% of its yield on average. This line, this LN97 line, is more tolerant. It only loses 6%. And so that's just within soybean, and this is just within soybean that actually grow within this region of the Midwest. Similarly for high CO2, in green here, these plants are grown in ambient CO2. The blue is elevated CO2. This is a variety that basically shows no response to high CO2. This one shows a 25% stimulation. And so the fact that genetic variation exists means that we can understand the genes and the mechanisms that are controlling this variation. And so you can cross the extreme responders by one another, and you can dissect the genetic mechanisms that are causing that response. And so we are beginning to do this. And so we do have some physiological understanding of plant responses to high CO2, and those have identified a number of targets that really are opportunities to maximize production in the future. And so from 2005 to 2050, the global demand for crop calories is projected to increase by 100%, and the demand for crop protein is expected to be 110%. And so our major crops right now are gaining about 1% per year, each year, in terms of their yields. And that's not good enough. It's going to take a quantum leap off of this steady increase, basically, to meet this demand for calories in the future. And so, and genetic variation does exist in crop responses to climate change, and there are biotechnological advances that enable improvement of multiple traits in these crops. And so I rattled through that pretty quickly, and I did that because I'd like to just talk a little bit to this audience about teaching controversial subjects. And so I think this is something that is particularly important if you're teaching climate change or if you're teaching food security. It's important to acknowledge that these are controversial subjects. And so controversy, and particularly with climate change, is not to do with different levels of knowledge and information, but it's really to do with different opinions and values and priorities, and essentially with different material interests. And so at the heart of climate change is there's the debate, is it real? And who do we believe? And that's you know, it might be a question of evidence, it might be a question of ideology, or maybe it's a question of both. And there's essentially two perspectives that are out there in the public and in the media. And the one perspective, and that's the one that I talked about most of today, is the international consensus. And this is really represented best by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the information that they put out. And then the second perspective is really the contrarians, and that's the side that takes a much more skeptical view to climate change. And so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the consensus is essentially that over geological time, temperature has ranged from 2 degrees Celsius to 27 degrees Celsius. And this is the average over the last 10,000 years has been 14 degrees Celsius. During the course of human history, this has only fluctuated by 1 degree Celsius. And now I showed you that in the last 100 years, we've increased global temperatures by another degree. Okay, and so that's as a result of increasing CO2 in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases. The global average temperatures may rise by anything from 1 to 11 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. And so it's also been calculated that in order to stabilize the climate, greenhouse gases may need to be cut by as much as 70%. Okay, and so this is the consensus. This is the scientific consensus for climate change. And because of this consensus, Kyoto was formed. The Kyoto Protocol was an attempt to reach an international agreement. And so this is really, this is the scientific evidence, and then the output from that was the Kyoto Agreement. But there were major countries that refused to ratify that, and the United States was one of them. And so that's certainly very confusing, because you have the scientific community and you have the UN and the World Health Organization saying that this is a problem, yet you have governments refusing to believe it. And so that's certainly confusing. And to add to the confusion, there's a number of groups like the Heritage Foundation and the American Petroleum Institute, as well as other lobbying groups that really question the science behind climate change. And so they essentially fear that ratifying any of these agreements would have an economic cost that's too great. And in this country, this is winning at the moment. And so, if you read some of the quotes from the websites from these, this is from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. This quote: "They question global warming alarmism. They make the case for access to affordable energy. They oppose energy rationing policies, including Kyoto, cap and trade, and the EPA regulation of all and any greenhouse gases." And so this is really the other viewpoint. This is kind of the skeptical side. And so that's the controversy. And so the question is it about scientific evidence? Is it about two opposing views? And most of us, when we teach, if there's opposing views, we give equal voice to both views, right? And we take kind of an enlightenment view. And you have one side debate and the other side debate, and the best side wins. And perhaps this isn't really appropriate in the case of climate change, because it's not about evidence, it's not about the science, it's certainly about different worldviews. It's about ideological differences. So the consensus view, the one that's reported by the IPCC, comes from the work of innumerable scientists around the world. And this has been questioned recently, most recently really with the questioning of the science that was done at the University in Nottingham. And the skeptics are constantly challenging this view, but really the IPCC represents what we know about the science. And the questions come from whether it's more important to control the amount of greenhouse gases and the rate that we let climate change, or whether it's more important to have basically a free market. Or not a free market, but have freedom to grow economically by whatever means. And so how do you teach about climate change? And so there certainly is a growing agreement that it should be taught, whether it's in a social studies class, or whether it's in a science class, or in a geography class. There's much less written about how that should be taught. But I think just a couple of ideas, considering the question who to believe. This may appear to be a question about evidence, but I think it's also one about ideology, and I think that's very important for students to understand. And I think having students look at short extracts on climate change from the media, from scientific reports, and from lobbying groups can be enlightening, and asking the questions, why are they different from each other, in what ways are they different, and what does the evidence suggest? Certainly, if you give students the source of each extract and ask them to consider why the source might be influenced in one way or the other, that can be quite informative. And I think that the main ideological interests that can be considered are, first, if you look at media extracts, they need a dramatic story, and so certainly the stories on climate change are dramatic. And then the skeptic's rejection of the problem is usually on a technology front or on free market grounds, as I mentioned. And I think, finally, it is important to note that the consensus is much more powerful, at least scientifically, than the contrarian lobby. And so they're not equal sides of two sides of a coin. They're not equal sides of an argument. And I think mostly when we teach about climate change, we teach cognitive teaching or from a cognitive perspective about learning the facts. And having illustrations of indicators of climate change can be quite powerful when we're doing this teaching. So things like the heavy precipitation events. 8 of the top 10 years for extreme one-day precipitation have occurred since 1990. The intensity of tropical cyclones has increased. Sea levels have risen. This is something that's measurable across the world. And as well as the pH of the ocean, or the acidity of ocean, has also changed. Kind of from a plant perspective, and this is my background, the length of the growing season on average has increased. Plant hardiness zones, you can show a USDA map of the plant hardiness zones. So if you go to your local nursery and you want to buy plants to put in your yard, what you put in your yard today might not be what your grandparents put in that same yard, 40 or 50 years ago. So these zones are moving northward as the temperatures are increasing. And similarly, leaf and bloom dates have gotten earlier. And so if you look at lilac festivals and when they occur 2 weeks earlier now than they did 30 years ago. So these are quite powerful indicators that the climate is changing and that this is real. And this is all from a cognitive perspective. But when you're teaching issues that are controversial, things like climate change and things like food security, it's also important to think about the other perspective. And so the cognitive dimension is certainly learning new facts and concepts about global issues. But it may also be equally important to consider the affective dimensions, or the feelings that the students have as a result of this. And this is just from another study that suggested that there were 5 dimensions of learning about climate change, and that when students, whether they were children or adults, explored climate change in depth from a cognitive perspective, they felt so overwhelmed that they were incapable of action. And so I think that it's important to try to avoid that in our teaching. And so perhaps we need to think about some of these other dimensions in thinking about how we make our lesson plans. And so how do you do this? How do you teach? And what's been suggested, and all of this comes from some work of Hicks in the references in a previous slide. So I would recommend having a look at that. But one idea is to start by asking students what they feel they know about climate change. And this can be done in a small group or in a small classroom. And to follow that by asking them to share their hopes and their fears for climate change. And so the issue is not to diminish their fears, but it's just to listen to them, to give students a voice. And then if you bear those in mind, then what comes later can be done in the context of inquiry, which is quite important. And I think it's also important to consider the time scale. So many of your students may not really be able to think on a time scale of hundreds of years. It may be more important to focus on the 20 to 50 year time scale. And so once you've taught it, what other things can you do? And so certainly I think that there are easy things that students can do to give them sort of an empowerment about these subjects. And in terms of climate change, one thing students can do is they can be taught to use their imagination to consider other people's experiences and to think about and express and explain their views that aren't their own. Certainly to negotiate, decide, and take part responsibly in both school and community activities. And so one of those may be just calculating the carbon footprint of their school. or of their dorm room that they live in, or of the apartment that they live in. And there's lots of good resources online, like carbonfootprint.com, to do these sorts of activities. And then there's other reformist actions that also can be quite empowering to students and can battle the sense of despair that they may feel from learning about things like climate change. And certainly food security falls in that realm of controversial issues. And so one may be to explain climate change to friends and parents, to have them do simple things like switch off lights voluntarily and increase recycling, or choose green products when they're shopping, or also to do things to protect or add new green spaces or trees to their environment. So I think, it's important to consider that there will always be debate about what the purpose of education is and what should be included in education, and that the worldviews that the students have that underlie these debates are powerful and complex. And so, whether something is controversial or not is not a question of your opinion or your evidence, but rather of your belief system. And that's increasingly important to consider when we're teaching about climate change and food security. Okay. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. So we have time for about probably one question, maybe two quick ones.
What do you mean by cognitive?
Cognitive perspective. I just mean learning facts. So cognition. So learning. So when you're teaching climate change, you often teach what was the temperature before the Industrial Revolution globally? What's it after? How much has carbon dioxide changed in the atmosphere? So these are learning facts versus how does the fact that spring came a month earlier make me feel? How does the fact that that's not cognitive, that's more affective? And so certainly in science, what we focus on is learning about facts and issues, and we focus much less on how these things make people feel. And it's quite, it's certainly a very different dimension to the education, but perhaps one that's becoming more important as we're teaching more controversial subjects.
And second question was, you said there was an increase by 100% global demand of crop yields between 2005 and 2050. Is that based on an extra consumption of meat, or are you using some particular global population?
That was from a study that was published in PNAS earlier this year. That's based on the change in population as well as the change in diet of that population. So that's based, and that's why protein has increased even more. And so that's based just on mostly population and the change in consumption of that population.
Which one item do you think is the most significant in the correlation in the change of the crops, the weather, et cetera?
I'm not really sure I understand what you're asking. What affects crop production the most?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question that really depends on location. So here in the temperate region, temperature does impact crop productivity, but whether there's rain, enough rainfall makes an even bigger difference. I mean in the Midwest of the U.S. If you're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, you can reach temperatures that are fatal for crop production. So we're already on a very warm year reaching a temperature where, pollen set doesn't happen, seed set doesn't happen because of pollen viability and often because of ovule growth or tube growth within the flower. And so that's a very location-specific question. I think in places where there's lots and lots of fertilizer that's been applied for 150 years now, nitrogen doesn't make as much of a difference as it certainly will do in sub-Saharan Africa, where it's basically not applied. And so that's quite a difficult question to answer globally, because it's going to be a location-specific answer.